This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, culture workers, and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Nicosia Shakes, who teaches in the Department of History and Critical Race and Ethnic Studies at University of California, Merced. In addition to essays and edited collections and journals such as Cultural Studies, Signs, Journal of Women in Culture and Society, The Black Scholar, the CLR James Journal, and Essex Salon, she is the author of Women's Activist Theater in Jamaica and South Africa, Gender, Race, and Performance Space, which won the National Women's Studies Association, University of Illinois Press First Book Prize. In this conversation, we discuss Black studies as an activist discipline, the importance of transnational comparative work, and the demands of multidisciplinary research and study. Nicosia, good morning. How are you today?
Good morning. I'm fine. Thank you. Just a little hot. It's the summer and I'm in Central California.
Yes.
But
It gets a little warm in that part of California. That's for sure. Well, team too hot. As I was telling you before we hit record, my home office, I forgot to turn on the air conditioner, and so it's warm. So if one of us faints in the middle of the podcast, we'll leave it in and say this is
dear.
climate. This is the urgency of climate change or something. Turn it into a moral lesson. Well, I'm really excited to have you on the podcast for a lot of reasons. I think the kind of research you're doing is really interesting and important. So I look forward to hearing about that and how you think it connects to the past and future of Black studies. But also, and I say this whenever we have guests with PhDs in the field, that for my collaborator, Ashley Newby, and I both, it's really important that we have voices on the podcast who have doctoral training in the field. I think that's a very particular kind of perspective and absolutely the foundation of thinking hard about the field of Black studies and where it's going. So that's all a way of saying welcome to the Black Studies Podcast, and I really look forward to chatting.
Thank you.
So we'll have a chance, of course, to, as I said, to talk about your research and think about its relationship to the field of Black studies and how you imagine that field of Black studies. But I wanted to start with that more personal question and ask you, what is it that drew you to Black studies? What drew you to the study of Black life generally? And what keeps you connected to and sustains you in relation to this kind of work?
Well, I've been drawn to Black studies informally for a long time, mostly through my father. Edward Shakes. I read a number of canonical texts from I was a child when I was in high school. You know, my father bought me Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And I read his copy of CLR James's The Black Jacobins. So I had an early interest in the study of Africa and the African diaspora and the study of Black people. So I did undergrad at the University of the West Indies in Kingston, Jamaica. I majored in political science and international relations. And the approach taken at the UWI is pretty holistic, the political approach, that is. So there is a lot of study of identity politics, a lot of study of culture and politics and how they interact, a lot of study of anti-colonial thought, specifically in the Caribbean, as well as the Black radical tradition in the Caribbean. And while I was majoring in those two social science disciplines, I was also involved in theater on campus. I was, at one point, the president of the University Dramatic Arts Society, and a lot of the work that we did in studying and performing canonical plays had to do with those questions of race and ethnicity and inequality. And I went on to do my master's in government at the same university, the UWI. After that, I started working at a Pan-African institution, Liberty Hall, the legacy of Marcus Garvey, which used to be the Kingston headquarters of Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. For the listeners who don't know much about Marcus Garvey, he is one of the most influential Black freedom fighters in history. He formed the largest Black organization in history, the Red, Black, and Green, that is so important in Black freedom struggle, in recognition of emancipation, recognition of civil rights, and so on, was initiated and popularized by Marcus Garvey's UNIA. So, a pretty important figure in Black Black radical thought, Black revolutionary thought around the world. And I worked at this institution. I was the chief researcher for the Marcus Garvey Multimedia Museum. And I did a lot of work organizing and going out, talking mostly to students in high schools and primary schools, what we call elementary schools in the US, about Black history, about Marcus Garvey, about African history, and so on. And I was doing my theater work at the same time, part-time still, working with a group called the University Players, who were mostly graduates of the UWI, but also professional actors. So I was doing that work before I started doing a PhD in Africana Studies in the US. I came to the US to do my PhD in Africana Studies because I had made up my mind that if I'm going to do a PhD, it has to be in something that I'm passionate about and something that I've already been doing, I've already been practicing. And I was part of the first cohort of PhD students at Brown University. The program started in 2011, and I started in 2011. So, in many ways, being a formal Black Studies scholar is what should I'm trying to find the word. So it is it's like a scholarly affirmation of an interest that I've had since I was a child, and of a practice that I've been engaging in since I left university. That's most of my professional life has already been spent in the study of Africa and African diaspora, and the study of Black people's place in history.
I love that as the coherence in the sense of all these pieces holding together in that story, and the way, as you said, Africana Studies as a PhD program ends up, holding all those things together, that the theater performance stuff, the political education, the political history, all of that. I love how that fits together. I have to ask, how old were you when your father gave you or was encouraging you to read Black Jacobins? I ask this because my students complain it's too hard. So I want to be able to point to this podcast and have a number and say, well, somebody else could do it.
It is not too hard. In fact, I don't think it's too hard because I think it's a very engaging read.
I agree.
I think I was around 16 years old when I read it. And I think I was 17 when I read How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. I actually think The Black Jacobins is a great text for high schoolers and younger undergrads because it's written in such an engaging way. And there are some high schools who actually, in the Caribbean, the last time I checked, I don't know if they still have it. There are some high schools that actually have the Black Jacobins on their curriculum. I don't know if the students have read the entire book or they just read excerpts of it. But that's interesting that they think it's a hard read.
I think there's students love to complain about stuff being hard to read or long or something like that. I couldn't agree more about it being really engaging, but those are two just phenomenal texts to to encounter, in your teenage years, as well as college through graduate school. So, and always happy to hear Walter Rodney's name pop up on the podcast.
Yeah.
I think while I think a lot of people think of that book as part of sort of Black Studies canon. I think it just continues to operate on the sort of margins of that, or sort of in name alone. I mean, those ideas continue to just they feel taken off the front page of a newspaper.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, since you have I'm always interested in this responses to this question, and especially because you have your PhD in the field, and given your narrative about how you came to Africana studies and what it affirmed in terms of your long trajectory of interest. But I'm interested to hear you talk about your portrait of Black studies, how you imagine the field, how it orients you. And I always ask this question in the context of the origins of the field, which had that tension built into it between a commitment to the intellectual tradition and a commitment to a kind of Black liberation politics. That comes really from its origin story, which was the student demand for there to be a place on campuses to study the Black intellectual tradition, that traditional disciplines hadn't done that. Black studies would do that, and Black studies has and continues to do that kind of work on campuses. But of course, the origins of Black studies also coincided with that radicalization of Black liberation struggle, where distinctions between campuses and communities, between classrooms and political mobilization, between books and ideas and prescriptive political action really got blurred and contested. And so I think we inherit that today in terms of a political commitment of Black studies. And those two things, the intellectual tradition and the political commitment, can have some tension between them in terms of the very meaning of the field. So I'm sort of couched in those terms. I'm interested to hear you talk about how you imagine Black studies, what that portrait is that you work with.
First and foremost, for me, Black studies is an activist discipline. And I know that there are different perspectives on that. I know that there are scholars who resist the idea of a discipline as activist. But I think it's very important when we explain what a discipline is, or the character of a discipline, to always go back to why it came into being in the first place.
Mhm.
And it came into being through the activism of the 1960s and previous to the 1960s, right? The anti racist, pro civil rights, but also anti colonial activism of that time period. So it is a discipline that is first and foremost committed to social change. Now, many disciplines will say that. But what makes Black studies stand out, and by extension, ethnic studies stand out, is that it is committed to a social change that involves challenging the most powerful traditions of our time, right? The most powerful and destructive traditions of our time, traditions and practices of our time, racism, colonialism, imperialism, right? All of the things combined with that, patriarchy, capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, etc. And so, because Black studies is always engaged in this constant challenge to the most powerful, right, sources of inequality of our time, then we can't get away from describing it as an activist discipline. There's no way to get away from that. So um, I don't see a difference between the intellectual imperative of Black studies and the political imperative of Black studies. And the reason is that when we think in an interdisciplinary way, then those types of distinctions start to fall apart. The politics of Black studies is there because the intellectual tradition of Black studies is inherently political. If you're challenging power, that is a political act within itself. Now, in practice, there is a challenge. How do we go about this? how are we thinking about thought and philosophy in a way where it's not always necessarily attached to a social movement? So we've had this conversation, for example, about feminism, Black feminism in relation to womanism. And some of the pushback from the people who don't want to engage with womanism or who think that womanism is not political enough is that a womanist perspective which accommodates spirituality and culture and talks about our relationship to the earth, that perspective isn't political enough, isn't challenging patriarchy as directly as feminism, whereas feminism can get attached to a number of social movements and a number of organizations. And so there is this tension about whether womanists, as if womanism and feminism are separate, whether womanists um, uh, they don't come out and say rational, whether womanism is rational enough, whether womanism is responding enough to the moment. And so my response to that is first and foremost to not separate them because there's a tendency to think it almost in a kind of Cartesian way, which is if one thing is like this and the other thing is like that, then the two things can't come together. We have to separate them. But my understanding of those two very important ways of thinking, paradigms innovated by Black women, is that you can't have one without the other. You can't have a feminist movement, or in particular, let's say it's a feminist movement that is looking at the combined effects of patriarchy and colonization, or a feminist movement that is specifically about reproductive rights, without thinking about the challenge that womanism poses to us, which is what is our relationship to our community? What is our community's responsibility to us?
Mm-hmm.
What are the ways in which we can use the arts and culture and spirituality to think about appreciating women as human beings, appreciating all of the things that Black women have been through, and drawing on the work of women or the work of people who didn't outrightly come out and say we're a feminist. So the idea that you can have an intellectual way of thinking that can't now get attached to a way of thinking about our place in the world or improving our place in the world, to me, is basically impossible.
Mm-hmm.
To me. I know that there are other people who might be able to do that. But the people who were calling for Black studies, mainly the students and the faculty and community workers who were calling for Black studies departments in the 1960s, were not just thinking in terms of Black faces on campus, more Black faces on campus, more knowledge about Black history. They were also thinking in terms of challenging certain conventions in academia that made it impossible for us to fully draw on the different ways in which Black communities think and organize.
Thank you for that. This is a fantastic response and really thoughtful. I think that example that you walked us through, the thinking about the relationship between Black feminism and womanism, is just really illuminating. So thank you for that. I mean, that alone will really stand out and makes this a really singular episode. So thank you for that. And I think what part of also what I liked about what you were saying is how you drew out how easy it is. The Cartesian idea, figure there is really helpful for me in thinking about this, but how easily we fall into a really thin or really austere idea of what intellectual life is and also what political life is, rather than the kind of richness of intellectual life and the richness of political life, which are so blended in these kinds of moments as you walked us through. Like there's, there's real substance to intellectual life that impacts how we live with other people. And, how do we think politically in our relationship with others, without thinking. And I think you drew the richness of both into our view. I love that. And also saying a reminder that the people who founded this field did not see this distinction
Yeah.
in the ways that sometimes we can fabricate or even argue about. And I don't want to call it a fabrication that prejudices the conversation, but what does it mean to think about the origins of the field, not seeing that distinction, and then us fighting over that distinction? It's also an odd distinction to have in 2026 as just the mere presence of the word Black in a grant proposal or in a curriculum might lead to federal discipline. So
Yeah.
there's that part. Well, let me shift a little bit to sorry for that. I loved what you said. I want to
No,
think about.
that's a really important point to make. The types of um power sources, the things that we are fighting against, the structures and systems that we're fighting against are not making distinctions between the intellectual and the political and the religious and the cultural.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Sometimes I wonder when we have these arguments, and I think all of us in the field have had them more than once. There is that moment where I'm like, are we sort of locked in this room, and outside is this whole other discourse? Yes, in fact, with action behind it at the political level. Well, let me shift a little bit to ask about your research. You've sort of indicated some of your interests, and I know that you're interested in political history and political theory, questions of gender and sexuality. Interest, as you said, goes back to your own work as an undergraduate, but also contemporary in terms of thinking and writing around performance studies. And this combination, there's so much for Black studies. For us to learn in Black studies from this convergence of interests. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how you think your collection of critical frames and interests relate to the past of Black studies. How does it fit in the tradition? But also, what boundaries do you think it pushes, or what new horizons do you think it opens up?
Well, I'm thinking in terms of what made me so interested in activism and performance. And this really goes back to my study of the early 20th century, the artists and activists and authors of the early 20th century in the Caribbean mostly and the United States. I mentioned before that my professional life started as a researcher at Liberty Hall, The Legacy of Marcus Garvey. I, at the same time, taught a course called Garveyism in the Americas and Africa, which was started by noted Garvey scholar Professor Rupert Lewis, who is one of my mentors. And a big part of my research and teaching was creating the context in which the Garvey movement spread throughout the world. And a lot of that had to do with the Garvey movement. The Universal Negro Improvement Association was formed in Jamaica, 1914, but it really became a massive movement after Marcus Garvey moved to the United States with the center in Harlem. And so this is around the time of the Harlem Renaissance as well. It's around the time when you have a lot of activism against lynching, what we would call an early civil rights activism as well. Pan-Africanism is also taking root, not just as a way of thinking, but as a very organized movement.
Hmm.
And all of these political movements are interacting with the Harlem Renaissance, with negritude, which came later, with the Black Arts movement as well. And at the same time, we have people like Zora Neale Hurston who are bridging scholarly work, and CLR James, who are bridging scholarly work with artistic work. So my interest in theater and performance, also coming from my work as an artist in theater, my interest in theater and performance gets blended with all of this research that I'm doing into early 20th century activism. I'm also very interested in the work that women are doing, particularly because, so there's been a lot of improvement in academia now with regard to highlighting the work of Black women, early 20th century, working in the early 20th century, and so on, and what Black women have contributed to the Black radical tradition. When I was in undergrad, there wasn't so much of that. It has improved. But I was also thinking about the women in the Garvey movement and about women artists and women playwrights and the roles that they were playing, and about specific Caribbean women's organizations. Sistren Theatre Collective is a highly influential women's theatre collective in Jamaica. And in many ways, when we think about theatre and activism, the first thing that comes to mind, if you're Jamaican, is Sistren Theatre Collective. So then all of these interests converge into my research project, and it gets widened to include women on the African continent, in particular South African women. The main idea, or the main scholarly directive that guides my research, is to see performance as a way of theory making,
Hmm.
as a way of knowledge making, beyond entertainment. And much of that comes from, as I said before, my study of the ways that a lot of Black activists blended scholarship with arts and political organizing. So for theater and performance, and in particular, expressive culture is an important way in which we imagine ourselves. It's an important way. It's not just how we express ourselves, but when you look at the types of art that we produce, it is important to how we imagine ourselves in relation to the rest of the world. And because expression, culture, including popular culture, is so much a part of how we represent ourselves, then it's an important tool of social change. So you have a number of scholars who have talked about this. Stuart Hall, What is This Black in Black Popular Culture, talks about the politics of representation, the notion that somehow representation it can happen without any type of politics attached to it, as if we just express ourselves without thinking. Marcus Garvey said art is the highest form of expression of human intelligence. A lot of the women whose work I study say similar things, that when they go out into these communities with theater, looking at theater and organizing and knowledge making, that the people they work with see this as a way for them to put issues to the public that they have no other way of putting to them. So right here, I want to pause a little and emphasize that one of the reasons why culture, popular culture, expressive cultures are so important, one of the reasons why those things are so important to Black people and to marginalized people, is that when people lack political and economic power, then the creative arts become the way in which they're able to actualize and spread their ideas. And so, for this reason, particularly when we're talking about women and the multiple forms of marginalization that Black women face, so that it is it beyond a way of expressing ourselves, beyond intellectual ways of thinking. This is important because it is one of the few ways in which we can grasp not just attention, but also one of the few ways in which we can organize and spread our ideas. So that's a long way of responding to your question.
It's
That's
not.
how I came to,
It's
yeah, the
not it's
work that
not
I'm
long at
doing.
all. I mean, it was that was really, brilliantly put, and I love it. I mean, it gave even more substance to what you had said previously about the relationship between intellectual work and political work. I mean, the question of culture is that the whatever that joins the richness, or connects the richness of political life, the richness and broad breadth of intellectual life. So I love that. That was really wonderfully put. And this also then, of course, makes me think about this next question, which is, the role of doing your work in Africana studies, right? That was your PhD. Now you're in a history and critical race and ethnic studies department. So you haven't worked in a traditional discipline. You didn't go through history into Black studies, right? And I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit about how that path into and now practice as a teacher and intellectual, how that path has shaped how you conceive a research question and write, but also how you shape and practice a classroom.
I think being trained in Africana studies allows me to always think in an interdisciplinary way. And if you take a look at my syllabi, you will see that. You will see a lot of history, a whole lot of history, but also a whole lot of political science, a lot of cultural theory. You will see anthropology. You will see some more and more. I've been incorporating legal theory as well into all of my syllabi, including the syllabi for the theater and performance classes. The challenge to that is I have to explain why that is to students, because many students don't come from an interdisciplinary form of training. They haven't really been exposed to that way of thinking beyond
Mhm,
disciplines.
mhm.
And so they have to kind of reshape the way they think about the relationship between legal theory and gender studies, for example. A good way of doing that is to draw on the work of people like Kimberly Crenshaw and the founders, the intersectionality and the founders of critical race theory, who were trained lawyers and legal theorists. One of the topics that we discussed in my last class on theories in critical race and ethnic studies was the reparations movement, and having to show them that there are legal bases for reparations. It's not a fringe movement. For a topic like that, you have to combine history, legal theory, political science, geography. And it's not easy. But I think that because I had that grounding, when you do a PhD in Africana studies, or I should say when I did it in Africana studies, it's a thing that is constantly like it's almost drummed into you. Okay, so what does this have to do with that? Why are you saying that this play is political?
Mm.
You know, um, it's also important to think transnationally. We're in the United States, so it is also almost natural for us to think of Blackness in terms of the United States and the Black experiences in the United States. But a transnational approach, which is what a lot of Black studies the scholars take, and definitely what Africana studies scholars take, will show you the ways in which the national and the transnational interact. So, for example, if you think of US imperialism, or if you think of wars that are happening abroad, you have to be able to see how domestic politics is interacting with imperialism overseas, right? You have to think in terms of the ways in which there are internal colonial procedures happening in the United States in terms of how certain communities are, how communities of color continue to be marginalized, how their spaces continue to be taken over through gentrification, etc. Colonial processes are very similar to these structural processes that are happening
Mhm.
within the United States. And a transnational way of thinking allows you to see that.
I love the thank you for all of that. I mean, it's
Mhm.
especially like when you said it's difficult, and this is a thing. It's come up in many podcasts for me. I always want to emphasize that the difficulty of Black Studies research is the demands it puts that you can't just sort of take a casual foray through another traditional discipline. There's a kind of mastery that you have to have of like visual studies in order to talk about film, legal studies in order to talk about the relationship between law and policy and so forth. So I like the way you laid that out. And I think it's also one of the enigmas of the Black Studies classroom is students encountering that for the first time, often, not always, but often for the first time. I teach a lot of film courses, and the way students, will come up to me after a few weeks and say, I didn't know I was supposed to look at a film and learn about identity, about politics, about philosophy, about narrative structure, about, visuality and blackness. And I'm like, well, you're in a Black Studies film course, that it's not that we have our own methods, but also that our methods require a depth of understanding of these other methods in order to shape and reshape them. So, I like the way you walked us through that. And students are better for it, but I definitely have a lot of those moments where I thought I was just going to give my opinions on whether I like Sami Zanga or, or Black Girl more or something like that. So,
And to just look at the techniques and judge the film's merit based on the quote unquote artistic techniques.
yeah.
Yeah.
And this is one of the reasons why I was really excited to have you on the podcast is also speaking from the transnational perspective. I mean, Black Studies, you had that moment where you said we're in the United States, and so it's natural. But I love not just the push to think transnationally, but as you pointed out, what that transnational study does for our understanding of something as local as gentrification, thinking about colonial processes. I mean, when you were saying that, I was like, and want to turn it into my own, podcast. But I was like, this kind of thing drives me a little bit crazy because I'm like, the literacy is not just there to be more inclusive. Transnational literacy is there to understand with depth what a global phenomenon we're living in our neighborhoods.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So that's my way of giving a sort of testimony to like how much I appreciate what you said there. Last couple of questions for you. First one is thinking about Black studies in an historical frame, past and future. What do you think that the field has done well, and what do you think it has not done particularly well?
Okay.
I just wish that we had video because you just took off your glasses and took a deep breath. So one part where I wish we could just have that little snippet. So I can't wait to hear what you got to say.
So we need to have a Black Studies conference around this topic. That's the first thing I thought when I saw your question. And assuming that we have not had one, I think that we are really at a moment when we have to, given everything that's happening globally and nationally, we really have to think about the state of Black studies today. Black studies has done a lot well. Black studies has, in many ways, changed the ways in which the academy thinks about race and thinks about not just Black people, but also marginalized people. We know that Black studies and Africana studies has given rise to and shaped other ethnic studies departments and scholarship, and not just in ethnic studies, but other departments and programs that are committed to social change have been inspired by Black studies.
Mm-hmm.
Black studies has introduced and also popularized a number of concepts that have gone even beyond academia towards how even regular people think. So that you have, I mentioned critical race theory earlier, the work of Bell and Delgado and other scholars. So we see CRT being misrepresented intentionally. And I wondered if I should use it as an example. But the ideas of a CRT have been used without even people necessarily being conscious about it. The basic idea of how race is attached to different outcomes, how life outcomes, your life outcomes as a Black person, as a brown person, rely a lot on your race. And that comes from a lot of research into the justice system, etc., etc. Scholars of structural racism and systemic racism have in many ways transformed how we think about racism as not just an interpersonal thing, or thinking beyond racism as just something that the KKK does or the Nazis do, right? So that racism is not just about an extreme expression of racial hatred, but it's also systemic, it's structural. I mentioned intersectionality before. The work of the Combahee River Collective. There's just so much there in terms of theory and paradigms and methods of doing research that Black studies as a discipline has disseminated throughout the academy, but also throughout our society. And that contribution has to constantly be acknowledged. There is a way that the contributions that Black people have made to the United States and to the world get pushed over or misrepresented or not acknowledged. And I think Black studies is an example of how Black people and other people of color have contributed immensely to academia and to intellect, just not just academic intellect, but intellect of ordinary people. So that's really, really important. Now, what has Black studies not done particularly well? Here's the thing. We are in the academy. We're still in the academy.
That's a great point to start with.
And
Yes.
because
Set the stage.
we are in the academy. So George Lipsitz has a new book now, Ethnic Studies at the Crossroads, where he talks about being in the academy and the contradictions of that. Rodney talked about that as well. Sylvia Winter has talked a lot about that, right? We're still in the academy. And academia has been one of the main sites in which racist, imperialist, colonial, patriarchal ideas have spread, and not necessarily in a direct way, but just in the way that academia operates.
Mm-hmm.
Academia in general still operates as if it is a site for middle class or wealthy white men with stay-at-home partners. You see that in terms of the type of output that is demanded from us.
Mm-hmm.
But so we are still in the academy. We still abide by a lot of the same rules about pedagogy in the academy, about how you get tenure, how you get promotion, right? And so I wonder if some of the ways in which we emphasize publishing and publishing traditional scholarship is preventing us from achieving the types of relationships with marginalized communities that we would like to achieve. I think we still think of scholarship in a very exclusionary type of way. I still think that we separate. There's still a separation of intellect versus art versus you know um, versus a way of teaching that is traditional. So I still think that there's a way that we're bound by our position in the academy. I don't know that we have met the challenge that Sylvia Winter posed to us. Sylvia Winter's essay with the long title on how we mistook the map for the territory and re-imprisoned ourselves in our unbearable wrongness of being. Black Studies Toward the Human Project. And the main point of the essay is that Western society has imposed on the rest of the world, Western society in particular, Europe, starting with Europe, European expansion into the rest of the world, has imposed an idea of the human, which is still privileging white people, and especially wealthy white men. The ways in which we think about culture, who has the most valuable culture, who has the most valuable political system, religion, etc., all of those things are bound up with colonialism. And we are seeing the modern iterations of this being live streamed before us. The genocide continues in Palestine, invasions that are happening, regime change experiments that have been catastrophic for local populations. I don't know that we have met the challenge of really interrogating how white supremacy operates in very stealthy ways. I think we acknowledge it. I don't know that we have done enough to deconstruct it in a way where we are not still affirming Eurocentrism or affirming ideas that the West is superior to everywhere else. And that is the challenge of the 21st century.
I know that people are, some people, not myself, but a lot of people are really in a rush to sort of move beyond or get rid of the term decolonial or decolonization. But what you've outlined there is one of the most intimate and difficult questions of decolonization. Right.
Mm-hmm.
What does it even just
Yeah.
mean to look at the work we do and how we value it and how we orient ourselves in relation to each other and our work. And I love that. That's a fantastic challenge to have. And maybe that's already a response to this last question, which is in a Black Studies context, what is the one question you would want us to all be asking or the one issue you would want us to all be thinking about?
I'm trying to narrow it down to one, but for me, the most urgent issue of our time is how we think transnationally. How do we think beyond the nation state as an identity as well as a tool of imposing racist power? So I'm going to try to quickly explain what I mean. I think the last few years have shown us that we cannot separate, that imperialism is still very much alive, even though we're seeing the implosion of Western imperialism through all of the protests happening against oppressive regimes in Europe and in the United States, that we still need to think of how our local and national systems of oppression are connected to foreign systems of oppression. I know that there is a debate, which should not be a debate, about whether or not Black people should take it upon themselves to be interested in what happens to the Palestinians, or whether Jamaicans should be interested in racism in the US, whether Black Americans should care about what happens to other people in other parts of the world when they are so brutalized. And I think we cannot separate our local oppressions and our national oppressions from the global oppressions. When we study history, we see the connection. We see the connection between post-revolutionary Haiti, when Haiti was forced to pay France reparations, when Haiti was bullied by the West into paying its former enslavers reparations after the slave trade. We see it in the way Haiti was punished over the centuries for having the gall to free themselves, right? There's a link between that and the destruction of Black communities in the United States in the Reconstruction era and the early 20th century. So if we're talking about Tulsa, Oklahoma, we're talking about Rosewood in Florida, we have to be able to connect that with Haiti. We have to be able to connect racist backlashes against anti-racist measures. When you look in the United States, whenever you have any type of gain in anti-racism, right? When there is a gain, it gets rolled back at some point. There's a racist backlash against it. So Juneteenth is a holiday. There's a racist backlash against that. The Supreme Court has gotten rid of affirmative action. There's a backlash against that, right? And so there is a link between that and the notion that the Western world must tell people in Asia and Latin America and the Caribbean and Africa what they are supposed to do. That those people are only legitimate if the West recognizes their governments.
Yeah.
That the West has the right to enact regime change. There's a link between that and the backlash against anti-racist measures in the United States. And if we cannot see that, then I don't know how far our activism is going to get. I do think that there are a lot of people who see that. You see Ghana now almost at the forefront alongside African American and Caribbean activists in the discussion about reparations. That's a form of transnational thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So there are people doing it on an individual level, but I think that we are so... and to an extent, we understand it. When you're living with oppression every day that is right in front of your face and you're experiencing it, it's very hard to think about what is happening hundreds of thousands of miles away to another set of people. It's hard, right? But if we cannot make those transnational links, I don't know that our national struggles will get very far.
What an amazing place to wrap up. This has just been a fantastic episode and so many insights across this 50-something minutes for everyone listening, and I mean, it's given me a lot to think about. So I appreciate that. And this place to wrap up is it's really profound, a really important challenge. That's both a challenge of politics and a challenge of imagination, and blends the two of them in the ways that really pull all of your reflections together. So thank you so much for that. I also love the way James and Rodney, as these early influences, show up even in this very last comment. It's like the very Jamesian, very Rodneyan kind of sentiments. So I appreciate all of this. And your thoughtfulness is just such a great contribution to this series. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. Thank you, John.
And you have a great rest of your day.
You too. Stay cool.